The gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder, sending a flock of starlings scattering into the fading twilight as Vivian Harper clutched her swollen belly and ducked behind a boulder. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she peered around the edge, watching the dust settle on the trail behind her. 6 months pregnant and on the run, she had nowhere left to go except forward, toward the small town of Redemption tucked in the foothills of the Wyoming Territory. April 1876 was unseasonably cold, and Vivian shivered in her thin dress as she resumed her arduous trek. The stagecoach that had abandoned her at the crossroads was long gone, the driver unwilling to delay his schedule for a pregnant woman who'd vomited twice since breakfast. "Rattlesnake Ridge is just over yonder," he'd said, pointing vaguely westward. "Redemption's in the valley beyond. Walk straight, you'll find it before dark." Dark was coming fast now, and Vivian's swollen ankles protested with each step. The distant gunshot had only hastened her already quickening heart. Her husband, no, her late husband's associates would not give up easily. Thomas Harper's gambling debts had died with him, but the men he'd borrowed from disagreed, and they'd made it clear that his widow and unborn child would pay what was owed, one way or another. As Redemption came into view, Vivian felt a rush of relief that quickly faded as she took in the dilapidated buildings and empty streets. The town looked barely alive, with only a few lamps glowing in windows. A hand-painted sign swung on rusty hinges. "Redemption Pop, 143. Below it, someone had scratched "God Help Us All." The saloon appeared to be the only establishment showing signs of activity. Piano music drifted out along with raucous laughter and the clink of glasses. Vivian hesitated at the edge of town, one hand on her belly, the other clutching her small carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and she jumped, nearly losing her balance. She needed shelter for the night, maybe work if anyone would hire a woman in her condition. The thought of entering the saloon made her stomach clench, but before she could decide on a course of action, the sound of approaching hoofbeats froze her in place. The massive stallion appeared first 17 hands high if he was an inch, coal-black against the darkening sky. But it was the rider who made Vivian's breath catch. He sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered and imposing in a long duster coat. His face was obscured by shadow beneath his wide-brimmed hat, but there was no mistaking the rifle balanced casually across his thighs. The horse slowed, and the man tilted his head slightly, studying her from beneath the brim of his hat. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Vivian's legs, after miles of walking, finally betrayed her. She stumbled, and in an instant the man had dismounted in one fluid motion and was at her side, one strong arm keeping her from falling. "Easy now," he said, his voice deep but unexpectedly gentle. "Town's no place for a lady in your condition after dark." Vivian found herself looking up into the most startling eyes she'd ever seen, one blue, one green set in a face that might have been handsome once, before the scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth had permanently twisted his features. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, hating the weakness in her voice. The stranger's mismatched eyes flickered to her belly, then back to her face. "You got family in Redemption?" "No, sir, no family anywhere." She straightened, trying to regain her composure. "I'm looking for work." A sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. Not much work to be had in Redemption these days. Not for anyone, let alone, he gestured vaguely at her condition. "I can cook, clean, so I'm stronger than I look." He studied her for another long moment, then sighed. "Name's Deacon." "Deacon Cross, Vivian Harper." "Well, Mrs. Harper, you picked about the worst place in the Wyoming Territory to start anew." He glanced toward the town, then back at her. But seeing as you're here, let's get you somewhere warm." She hesitated, eyeing the massive man warily. Everything about him screamed danger, from his scarred face to the weapons she now noticed strapped to his belt. As if reading her thoughts, he stepped back, giving her space. "You can trust me or not, madam. Your choice. But night's coming, and with it, men a lot less inclined to leave a woman be." Deacon's horse snorted impatiently, pawing at the ground. The animal was as intimidating as its master, with powerful muscles rippling beneath its glossy coat. "Does your horse have a name?" Vivian asked, surprising herself with the question. Something like amusement flickered in Deacon's eyes. "Judgment, that's ominous. It fits." He reached for her carpet bag. "May I?" She nodded, and he secured it to his saddle before turning back to her. "Can you ride?" Yes, but without waiting for her to finish, he lifted her with surprising gentleness and placed her on Judgment's back. The horse stood perfectly still, as if understanding the fragility of its new burden. Deacon took the reins and began leading them toward town. As they approached, Vivian noticed curtains twitching in windows, faces appearing and quickly disappearing. The piano music from the saloon faltered, then stopped entirely as they passed. "They're afraid of you," she observed quietly. Deacon didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was flat. "They have reason to be." They stopped in front of a small building set apart from the others. A hand-painted sign identified it as Widow Jensen's boarding house. "Wait here," Deacon said, tying Judgment to a post before disappearing inside. Vivian sat uneasily on the massive horse, feeling increasingly conspicuous as more faces appeared in windows. A group of men had gathered on the saloon porch, watching her with undisguised curiosity. One of them, bolder than the rest, approached. "You lost, madam. That there's the beast's horse you're sitting on." "The beast," she repeated. The man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Deacon Cross. Killed more men than smallpox, they say. You do well to get clear of him." Before Vivian could respond, the boarding house door opened, and Deacon emerged. The man who'd been speaking to her scurried back to the saloon like a startled rabbit. "Room's yours for the night," Deacon said, returning to help her down. "Widow Jensen doesn't usually take in strays, but she's made an exception." Vivian's feet had barely touched the ground when the boarding house door opened again, revealing a tiny, silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. "So this is your pregnant woman, Cross?" the woman demanded. "Doesn't look like your type." "She's not my anything, Mrs. Jensen. Just a traveler needing shelter." The old woman harumphed. "Well, get her inside before she catches her death. I've got stew on, and she looks like she hasn't eaten in days." Deacon guided Vivian toward the door with a light touch at her elbow. "Mrs. Jensen's stew is worth the price of the room alone," he said quietly. "Though her conversation might make you regret having ears." Despite herself, Vivian felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. The boarding house was modest but meticulously clean, with faded wallpaper and well-worn furniture that spoke of better days. Mrs. Jensen led them to a small dining room where a pot of stew bubbled on a cast-iron stove, filling the air with the savory aroma of rabbit and herbs. "Sit," the widow commanded, and Vivian obeyed, sinking gratefully into a chair. To her surprise, Deacon remained standing, hat in hand. "I'll leave you to it then," he said, nodding to Mrs. Jensen. "Put her room on my account." "I can't accept that," Vivian protested. "I have some money." "Save it," Deacon advised. "You'll need it." Mrs. Jensen crossed her arms. "You're not staying for supper, got business at the saloon." The old woman rolled her eyes. "You always do." She turned to Vivian. "Your man's not much for conversation, but he pays his debts and doesn't cause trouble under my roof, which is more than I can say for most in this town." "He's not my man," Vivian corrected quickly. "We just met on the road." "That's so." Mrs. Jensen gave Deacon a look Vivian couldn't interpret. "Well, even a beast can do a good turn once in a while, I suppose." Deacon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Good night, ladies." He settled his hat back on his head and was gone before Vivian could thank him properly. Mrs. Jensen watched him go, then turned back to the stew. "Man of few words, our Mr. Cross, but his money spends same as anyone's." She ladled a generous portion into a bowl and placed it in front of Vivian. "Eat. You're feeding too, from the look of it." Vivian didn't need to be told twice. The stew was indeed as good as Deacon had promised, rich with meat and vegetables. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper meal. "How far along?" Mrs. Jensen asked, sitting across from her with her own bowl. 6 months, give or take." "Father," Vivian hesitated. "My husband died 3 months ago. Cholera." It wasn't entirely a lie. Thomas had been sick when the men he owed money to caught up with him. Whether it was the disease or the beating they gave him that actually killed him was a distinction Vivian tried not to dwell on. "Sorry to hear it, Mrs. Jensen said, though her tone suggested she'd heard worse tales. "What brings you to Redemption? Not much here for anyone these days, let alone a widow with a baby on the way." "I'm heading to Oregon. My cousin has a millinery shop in Portland." Another lie. Vivian had no family left and no destination beyond getting as far from St. Louis as possible. "Oregon's a long way off. Stagecoach, when I can afford it." Mrs. Jensen studied her with shrewd eyes. "Well, you won't be going anywhere for a while, not in your condition. The next stage doesn't come through for 2 weeks and the mountain passes are still snowed in." Vivian's heart sank. 2 weeks. The men pursuing her would certainly catch up by then. "I need work," she said firmly. "I can't afford to stay idle." "Work?" Mrs. Jensen snorted. "Town's half dead since the silver mine dried up. Most folks who could leave already have." "There must be something." "Laundry, cooking, cleaning. Doc Miller might need help at his office," the widow conceded. "His nurse left with the last batch of folks heading to California. But that wouldn't pay much, and he's getting on in years himself." It was a start. "I'll speak with him tomorrow." Mrs. Jensen nodded. "Finish your stew, then I'll show you to your room. It's small, but it's clean, and no one will bother you here." "Thank you, and please, when Mr. Cross returns, tell him I'm grateful for his kindness." The old woman's expression turned curious. "Cross doesn't usually involve himself with strangers, especially not women in your condition. How'd you two really meet?" Vivian met her gaze steadily. "Just as I said, on the road into town." Mrs. Jensen clearly didn't believe her but seemed to decide not to press the issue. "Well, whatever your story is, you picked an interesting protector. Half the town's terrified of him, the other half wishes he'd move on." "Why do they call him the Beast, Mrs.?" Jensen's weathered face grew somber. "That's his story to tell if he's of a mind to, which he won't be. Man's as closed as a bank vault on Sunday." She stood, gathering their empty bowls. "Come on, you need rest." The room was indeed small, just enough space for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers, but as promised, it was clean, with fresh linens on the bed and a small vase of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. "Privy's out back," Mrs. Jensen explained. "Pumps in the kitchen if you need water in the night. Breakfast's at 7. Left alone, Vivian sank onto the bed, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. She placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the reassuring movement of the child within. "We're safe for tonight," she whispered. "And tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." But as she drifted toward sleep, her thoughts kept returning to mismatched eyes and a scarred face, to gentle hands that belied a fearsome reputation. Deacon Cross was a puzzle, and despite her precarious situation, or perhaps Because of it, Vivian found herself curious about the man they called the Beast. Dawn came too early, filtering through thin curtains and painting the small room in pale gold. For a moment, Vivian forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for a husband who was no longer there. Reality returned with cruel swiftness, and she sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her back. The town of Redemption was beginning to stir. Through her window, Vivian could see people moving along the main street, women heading to the general store, men gathering outside the blacksmith shop. It looked almost normal in the morning light, less desolate than it had appeared the previous evening. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, the blue calico, with only minor mending at the hem, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Jensen was already at work in the kitchen, frying bacon and mixing biscuit dough. "Sleep well?" the widow asked without looking up. "Better than I have in weeks," Vivian admitted. "May I help with breakfast?" Mrs. Jensen nodded toward a basket of eggs. "You can scramble those if your hands are steady." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the sizzle of bacon and the rhythmic thump of Mrs. Jensen's rolling pin the only sounds. "Your Mr. Cross came back late," the widow said eventually. "Paid for your room through the week." Vivian nearly dropped the egg she was cracking. "He what?" "I told him I couldn't accept. Man doesn't do anything he doesn't want to do," Mrs. Jensen interrupted. "Said to tell you it's a loan, not charity. You can settle with him when you're on your feet. Where is he now? I need to speak with him." "Gone. Rode out at first light." Mrs. Jensen glanced at Vivian, a knowing look in her rheumy eyes. "Don't get any ideas about that one, girl. Deacon Cross isn't the kind of man who settles." "I wasn't," Vivian flushed. "I simply wanted to thank him properly and make arrangements to repay him." "MMHMM." The widow didn't sound convinced. "Well, he keeps a cabin up in the hills. Comes to town every few days for supplies and to handle whatever business he has at the saloon." "What business is that, exactly?" Mrs. Jensen shrugged. "Not my place to say. Man's entitled to his privacy." She thumped the rolling pin with finality. "Now, if you're serious about work, Doc Miller's office is the white building at the end of the street. He usually starts seeing patients around 9. After breakfast, Vivian made her way through the town, acutely aware of the curious stares following her progress. Redemption was indeed a town in decline. Several storefronts stood empty, their windows dusty and dark. But there were signs of life, too. Children playing in the schoolyard, women hanging laundry, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against his anvil. The doctor's office was easy to find, its white clapboard exterior freshly painted, with a small sign reading J. Miller, M.D. Hanging beside the door, Vivian knocked, straightening her shoulders and smoothing her dress. The man who answered was older than she'd expected, well into his 70s, with a shock of white hair and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Yes," he asked, peering at her over the rims of his glasses. "Dr. Miller? My name is Vivian Harper, Mrs. Jensen mentioned you might be in need of assistance." His bushy eyebrows rose. "Did she now? And what sort of assistance do you imagine you could provide in your condition, Mrs. Harper?" Vivian refused to be cowed. "I can clean, organize, keep records. I worked as a school teacher before my marriage, so my penmanship is excellent, and I learn quickly." Dr. Miller studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, then. Let's see what you know." The examination room was spotless but cluttered, with medical texts stacked on every available surface and jars of mysterious substances lining the shelves. A treatment table occupied the center of the room, and various instruments were arranged neatly on a nearby tray. "You know anything about medicine?" the doctor asked, gesturing for her to sit. "Only what I've learned from books and observation. My father was something of a scholar, and we had several medical texts in our home library. Book learning's all well and good, but medicine's a practical science. He eyed her belly critically. When are you due? Late July, I believe. First child, she nodded. Father, deceased. Dr. Miller made a sympathetic noise. Sorry to hear it. You planning to stay in redemption? I haven't decided yet, the doctor snorted. Not much to decide about. Town's dying. Another year, maybe two, and it'll be a ghost town unless something changes. He sighed, looking around the cluttered office. Still, folks who remain need doctoring, and these old hands aren't as steady as they once were. He picked up a ledger from his desk and handed it to her. My accounts are a mess. Last 3 months of visits and treatments aren't recorded properly. Think you can make sense of it? Vivian opened the book to find a chaotic jumble of hasty notations, some barely legible. I believe so, yes. Good. You can start today. Pays $2 a week, plus room and board if you need it, though I hear Cross is covering your stay at the widow's. News traveled fast in small towns. Yes, though that's only temporary, I intend to support myself. Dr. Miller nodded approvingly. Admirable. Office hours are 9 to 4 except Sundays. Emergencies come as they will. He paused, studying her face. Cross bring you to town. We met on the road. He was kind enough to help me find lodging. Kind isn't a word most folks around here would associate with Deacon Cross. The doctor's expression turned thoughtful. Still, man's been useful a time or two when things got rough. Just be careful, he's got a reputation. So I've heard, though I've seen no evidence of it myself. Well, you wouldn't, would you, being in your condition? Dr. Miller smiled faintly. Man's got his own code. Won't harm women or children, no matter the provocation. The rest of us menfolk, though that's a different story. Before Vivian could inquire further, the door opened and a young boy rushed in, his face pale with urgency. Doc. It's Pa. The press fell on him at the newspaper office. He's pinned bad. Dr. Miller was already grabbing his bag. Where's your mother, Danny? Trying to lift it off him, but it's too heavy. Mrs. Harper, we'll continue this discussion later. You're hired if you want the position. The doctor was halfway out the door as he spoke. Should I come with you? Vivian called after him. No, stay here. If anyone comes looking for me, tell them I'm at the Tribune office. With that, he was gone, following the boy at a surprisingly spry pace for a man his age. Left alone in the cluttered office, Vivian took a deep breath and turned her attention to the ledger. This, at least, was something she could manage. She found a pen and fresh ink and set to work, grateful for the distraction from her own problems. She was deep in concentration, carefully transcribing the doctor's scrawled notes into neat, orderly rows when the office door opened again. Expecting Dr. Miller, she looked up with a smile that froze on her face when she saw who stood in the doorway. The man was expensively dressed in a tailored suit, with a gold watch chain stretched across his vest and a derby hat in his manicured hands. His face was handsome in a cold, precise way, like a statue carved from marble. Mrs. Harper, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. How fortuitous to find you here. You've led us quite a chase. Vivian's blood turned to ice. Mr. Blackwood, Victor Blackwood, her late husband's primary creditor, smiled thinly. You remember me. I'm flattered. What do you want? Her hand instinctively moved to her belly. The same thing I wanted when we last spoke in St. Louis. Your husband's debt remains unpaid. He stepped further into the office, closing the door behind him. $5,000, Mrs. Harper, plus interest, of course. I don't have that kind of money. You know that. Yes, but you have something of equal value. His eyes flickered to her belly. A child fetches a good price these days, especially among certain wealthy families unable to conceive. A newborn with no questions asked. worth far more than your husband's paltry debt. Vivian felt sick. You're talking about selling my baby. I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. The child goes to a family of means, you're free of debt, and I recover my investment. Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. You have until the birth to reconsider. After that, I'm afraid my associates will have to take more direct action. Get out, Vivian whispered, her voice shaking with fury and fear. Blackwood placed his hat back on his head with deliberate care. We'll speak again soon, Mrs. Harper. In the meantime, I'd reconsider any plans to leave town. My men are watching the stage depot and the trails. There's nowhere to run that we won't find you. He tipped his hat and left as quietly as he'd come, leaving Vivian trembling with the implications of his threat. They'd found her. After weeks of running, changing coaches at every opportunity, taking circuitous routes, they'd still found her. She pressed a hand against her mouth to stifle a sob. What now? Where could she go? The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress, and she forced herself to take deep, calming breaths. We'll be all right, she whispered, though she had no idea how to make that promise a reality. The door opened again, and she nearly cried out before realizing it was Dr. Miller returning, looking weary but satisfied. Printing press slipped its moorings, he explained, washing his hands at the basin. Caught Edward Wells's leg, but nothing's broken. He'll be hobbling for a week. Or he stopped, noticing her expression. Mrs. Harper, are you unwell? She hesitated, weighing her options. If she told him about Blackwood, would he help her? Or would he simply ask her to leave, unwilling to bring trouble to his door? Just tired, she said finally. It's been a long morning. Dr. Miller didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Pregnancy takes a toll. Why don't you finish up that ledger tomorrow, go back to Mrs. Jensen's and rest? Thank you, doctor. I think I will. She gathered her shawl, her mind racing. She needed to leave Redemption, and quickly, but Blackwood had men watching the obvious exits. She needed help, and there was only one person in town who might be capable of providing it. Dr. Miller, she said, pausing at the door. You mentioned Mr. Cross has a cabin in the hills. Do you know where exactly? The doctor's bushy eyebrows drew together. North of town, up past the old mine. But it's no place for a woman in your condition, Mrs. Harper. Trails steep and rough. I was just curious, she lied. Thank you again for the position. I'll be back in the morning. The walk back to the boarding house felt interminable, every shadow potentially concealing one of Blackwood's men. By the time she reached Mrs. Jensen's, Vivian's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. The widow took one look at her face and steered her to a chair in the kitchen. You look like you've seen a ghost, girl. What happened? I need to leave town, Vivian said, too exhausted for pretense. Tonight, if possible. Mrs. Jensen's eyes narrowed. This have anything to do with that fancy-dressed man who was asking after you earlier? Vivian's heart skipped. He was here, came by this morning after you left, wanted to know which room was yours. I told him my boarder's business was their own. The old woman crossed her arms. You in some kind of trouble, ain't you? And don't bother lying, I'm too old for it. After a moment's hesitation, Vivian nodded. My husband owed money to dangerous men. They want to take my baby when it's born. Her voice broke on the last words. Mrs. Jensen's weathered face hardened. Over my dead body they will. She bustled to a cupboard and returned with a small revolver. You know how to use one of these? No, but then it's time you learned. The widow placed the gun on the table between them. Simple enough. Point and pull the trigger. 5 shots, so make them count. Vivian stared at the weapon, a Smith & Wesson by the look of it, small enough to fit in a pocket but lethal nonetheless. Mrs. Jensen, I appreciate the thought, but I can't just shoot people. Not asking you to shoot people, just men who'd steal a baby from its mother. Mrs. Jensen sat down heavily. But you're right about one thing: you need to leave town. Stage doesn't come through till next week, though. I was thinking of finding Mr. Cross. Maybe he could help." The widow's expression turned skeptical. "Cross? He's not exactly the knight in shining armor type, girl. He helped me once already, and he seems capable." "Capable of what? That's the question." Mrs. Jensen sighed. "But I suppose if anyone could get you out of town unnoticed, it'd be him. Man knows every trail and deer path in these hills. Do you think he would help me again? Hard to say. Cross doesn't usually involve himself in other folks' problems unless there's something in it for him." The widow studied Vivian thoughtfully. "Though he did pay for your room, which isn't like him at all." Hope flickered faintly in Vivian's chest. "I need to find him. Today. You can't go traipsing up to his cabin alone, not in your condition, and especially not with those men looking for you." Mrs. Jensen drummed her fingers on the table, thinking. "There's a boy in town, Danny Miller, the doctor's grandson. He sometimes takes supplies up to Cross when the weather's bad. For $1 he might be persuaded to carry a message. I'll pay it. Gladly." Mrs. Jensen nodded. "I'll send word to the boy. In the meantime, you stay inside, away from windows, and keep this with you." She pushed the revolver closer to Vivian. "Just in case." As the day wore on, Vivian's anxiety only increased. She paced the small confines of her room, the revolver hidden in the pocket of her dress, its weight a constant reminder of the danger she faced. Every sound from the street below made her start: hoofbeats, voices, the creak of wagon wheels. Evening was falling when Mrs. Jensen knocked softly on her door. "Danny's back," she said when Vivian opened it. "Cross says he'll come tonight after dark. You're to be ready to travel." Relief washed over Vivian like a wave. "He'll help me leave town, apparently." The widow looked troubled. "Though why he's willing to risk his neck for a woman he barely knows is beyond me. Man must have his reasons. Did he say anything else? Just that you should pack only what you can carry on horseback and be ready at midnight." Mrs. Jensen hesitated. "You sure about this, girl? Going off with a man like Cross in your condition?" "What choice do I have?" Vivian asked quietly. "Stay and let them take my baby." The old woman's face softened. "No choice at all, I suppose." She patted Vivian's arm awkwardly. "I'll have food ready for you to take. Now get some rest while you can. Something tells me you won't be getting much in the days ahead." Rest, however, proved elusive. Vivian lay on the narrow bed, fully dressed, listening to the sounds of the town settling into night. The saloon was in full swing, piano music and laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Somewhere, a dog barked incessantly. Closer at hand, the familiar creaks and groans of the boarding house marked Mrs. Jensen's movements as she prepared for bed. Midnight approached with agonizing slowness. Vivian had packed her few possessions: clothing, her mother's silver hairbrush, the small daguerreotype of her parents that was her most treasured possession. Everything fit easily into the carpet bag, with room to spare for the food Mrs. Jensen had prepared. At last, the mantel clock in the parlor chimed 12. Vivian rose, her heart pounding. She'd left a note for Dr. Miller, apologizing for her abrupt departure and thanking him for the opportunity he'd offered. Another note for Mrs. Jensen contained most of her remaining money payment for the room and board, despite Deacon's intervention. She crept downstairs, avoiding the steps that creaked, and made her way to the back door as Mrs. Jensen had instructed. The night air was cool against her face as she stepped outside, her eyes straining to see in the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the distant sounds of the saloon and the vast, star-strewn sky above. Then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the woodpile. "Mrs. Harper." Deacon's voice was barely above a whisper, but Vivian nearly jumped out of her skin. "Mr. Cross, You startled me. That's the idea." He moved closer, and she could make out his features now in the faint moonlight. The scar looked more pronounced in the silvery illumination, pulling his mouth into what might have been a permanent grimace. "You're ready," she nodded, clutching her carpetbag tighter. "Yes, thank you for coming. Don't thank me yet. We've got a long ride ahead and it won't be comfortable." He took the bag from her hands, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Judgment's waiting at the edge of town. We'll have to walk their horses' hooves make too much noise on these streets." They moved silently through Mrs. Jensen's small garden and into the alley beyond. Deacon led the way with the confidence of a man who could see in the dark, occasionally reaching back to guide Vivian around obstacles she might have stumbled over. "The man looking for you," he said after they'd walked for several minutes. "What does he want?" Vivian hesitated, then decided truth was the only currency worth spending at this point. "My husband owed him money, a lot of money. He says if I can't pay, he'll take my baby when it's born." Deacon stopped so abruptly that Vivian nearly walked into him. In the darkness, she couldn't see his expression, but the sudden tension in his body was palpable. "Take your baby," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "To sell. To a wealthy family," he said. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Deacon was silent for so long that Vivian began to wonder if he'd changed his mind about helping her. Then, very quietly, he said, "That's not going to happen." The simple conviction in his voice loosened something in Vivian's chest, a knot of fear she'd been carrying so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. They resumed walking, skirting the edge of town, staying in the shadows of buildings and trees. The saloon was still brightly lit, but the rest of Redemption had settled into slumber, windows dark and streets empty. At the town's northern boundary, where the main street gave way to the rutted trail leading into the hills, Judgment stood waiting, as black as the night around him. The massive stallion nickered softly at their approach, and Deacon ran a hand along his neck in greeting. "He'll carry double for a while," Deacon said, securing Vivian's bag to the saddle. "But not all the way to the cabin. Trail gets too steep." "Where are we going exactly?" "Someplace safe. Blackwood and his men don't know these hills like I do." He turned to her. "Can you mount, or do you need help?" Pride warred briefly with practicality in Vivian's mind. "Help, please." His hands were warm and steady as they circled her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. Once she was settled in the saddle, he mounted behind her in one fluid motion. One arm came around her waist, not holding her exactly, but steadying her as Judgment began to move. They rode in silence for a time, the horse picking his way carefully along the moonlit trail. The town fell away behind them, its lights dimming and then disappearing altogether as they entered the deeper darkness of the pine forest. "How did you know his name?" Vivian asked suddenly. "Blackwood. I never mentioned it." Deacon was quiet for a moment. "I've had dealings with Victor Blackwood before." "What kind of dealings?" "The kind that end with someone dead." His voice was matter of fact. "He's not a man who forgets a face, especially one like mine. If he saw me in town, he'd know something was up." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down Vivian's spine. "Is that why you're helping me? Because of some grudge against Blackwood?" "Does it matter?" "It does to me." Deacon sighed, the sound barely audible over the steady rhythm of Judgment's hooves. "I'm helping you because no child deserves to be taken from its mother and sold like cattle. The fact that it thwarts Blackwood is an added benefit." They lapsed into silence again as the trail began to climb more steeply. The forest pressed close around them, the trees so tall and dense that they blotted out much of the moonlight. Yet Judgment never faltered, moving with the confidence of an animal that knew the path well. As they rode, Vivian became increasingly aware of Deacon's presence behind her, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the careful way his arm held her secure without pressing against her belly, the rhythm of his breathing close to her ear. Despite the circumstances, there was something oddly comforting about it. "We'll stop here," Deacon said eventually, drawing Judgment to a halt in a small clearing. "Rest for a bit before the steeper climb." He dismounted first, then helped Vivian down. Her legs trembled slightly as they took her weight, stiff from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his mismatched eyes studying her face in the dappled moonlight. "I'm fine," she assured him, though in truth, her back ached fiercely and exhaustion pulled at her limbs like lead weights. Deacon didn't look convinced. "There's a stream just beyond those trees. Water's clean. I'll see to Judgment." The stream was exactly where he'd indicated, a narrow ribbon of silver winding between mossy stones. Vivian knelt awkwardly on the bank, cupping her hands to drink the icy water. It tasted of minerals and pine, pure in a way that made her realize how long it had been since she'd had fresh water not tainted by the taste of metal pipes or wooden barrels. When she returned to the clearing, Deacon had removed Judgment's saddle and was checking the animal's hooves by the light of a small, shielded lantern. He looked up at her approach, his scarred face thrown into sharp relief by the flickering light. "We should reach the cabin by dawn," he said, straightening. "But the trail gets rougher from here. You need to tell me if it gets to be too much." "I will," she promised, "though I'm tougher than I look." Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his face. "I'm starting to see that." He offered her jerky and dried fruit from his saddlebags, and they ate in companionable silence. The night was alive with sounds: the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant yip of coyotes hunting in the valley below. "Have you lived in these hills long?" Vivian asked, more to break the silence than from any real expectation of an answer. Deacon didn't strike her as the type to share personal details readily. To her surprise, he responded, 5 years, give or take, came west after the war. You fought? Union. Virginia mostly, then with Sherman in Georgia. His voice was flat, devoid of the pride or bitterness that often colored veterans' accounts of the conflict. Didn't much care for it. My father fought as well. He never came home. Deacon nodded, understanding in his eyes. A lot of good men didn't. And the not-so-good men, some of us made it back. There was a shadow in his voice that made Vivian regret her question. "I think you're a better man than you believe, Mr. Cross," she said quietly. "Not many would risk themselves for a stranger." Deacon looked away, busying himself with repacking the saddlebags. "We should move on. Still a ways to go." The rest of the journey passed in relative silence. The trail, as Deacon had warned, grew steeper and more treacherous. In places, it was little more than a deer path winding between towering pines and granite outcroppings. Judgment picked his way carefully, but even the sure-footed stallion had to pause occasionally to find secure footing. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when they crested a final ridge and the cabin came into view. It was larger than Vivian had expected, a solid structure of logs and stone, with a small corral for horses and what looked like a vegetable garden off to one side. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, suggesting someone was already there. "You have company?" Vivian asked, suddenly wary. "Just Dan," Deacon reassured her. "Danny Miller's older brother. He watches the place when I'm gone." As if on cue, the cabin door opened and a young man stepped out, rifle in hand. He was tall and lean, with the same sandy hair as the boy who'd fetched Dr. Miller to the newspaper office. "You're back early," he called as they approached. Then he caught sight of Vivian, and his eyebrows rose. "And with company." "Dan, this is Mrs. Harper," Deacon said as he helped Vivian dismount. She'll be staying with us for a while." Dan's surprise was evident, but he recovered quickly, tipping his hat to Vivian. "Madam, welcome to Redemption Ridge." The cabin's interior was surprisingly comfortable. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, with a solid wooden table and chairs at one end, and a sitting area with a worn but clean sofa at the other. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books more than Vivian would have expected from a man like Deacon. A narrow staircase led to what she presumed was a loft or second floor. "It's not much," Deacon said, watching her take it all in, "but it's weathertight and warm." "It's lovely," Vivian said honestly. After weeks of cramped stagecoaches and questionable boarding houses, the cabin felt like a haven. Dan had already set coffee to boil on the stove and was eyeing Vivian's condition with barely concealed curiosity. "Mrs. Harper, would you like to sit? You must be tired after the ride." "Thank you." She sank gratefully onto the sofa, relief washing over her as the weight was taken off her swollen feet. "I'll see to judgment," Deacon said, heading back outside. As soon as he was gone, Dan turned to Vivian, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Mrs. Harper, I hope you don't mind my asking, but do you know who Deacon Cross is?" The question caught her off guard. "I know the town calls him the Beast. Beyond that, not much." Dan nodded slowly. "There's a reason for that nickname. Deacon's not. He's not like other men. He's seen things, done things. We've all done things we regret, Mr. Miller. Call me Dan, please." He glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. "I just want you to understand what kind of man you're dealing with. Deacon was a scout during the war, then a bounty hunter after. They say he's killed more men than most soldiers ever see. And yet he's helping me," Vivian pointed out, "for no reason except that I needed help." Dan looked skeptical. "Deacon always has reasons for what he does, even if they're not obvious to the rest of us." He poured coffee into 3 mugs. "Just be careful is all I'm saying. He's not used to having people around, especially not." He gestured vaguely at her belly. The door opened before Vivian could respond, and Deacon returned, stamping snow from his boots. "Dan, you're needed in town. Your pa sent word there's trouble at the Tribune office again." Dan frowned. "The press didn't say, just that you should head back when you can. Right now. In the dark, first lights breaking, you'll be fine on the main trail." Deacon's tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Dan looked between Deacon and Vivian, clearly reluctant to leave. "I could wait an hour, help get Mrs. Harper settled. Now, Dan." Something passed between the two men, an unspoken communication that Vivian couldn't decipher. Finally, Dan nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll just grab my things." He disappeared up the stairs, returning moments later with a small pack. "Mrs. Harper, it was a pleasure to meet you, brief as it was." He offered her a small smile before turning to Deacon. "I'll stop by in a few days, check in." Deacon just nodded, and Dan left with a final concerned glance at Vivian. Once the sound of hoofbeats had faded, Deacon turned to her. "There's a room upstairs you can use. It's small, but it has a proper bed and a window that catches the morning sun." "Thank you. That's very kind." Vivian hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since Dan's abrupt departure. "Did you send him away because of me?" Deacon's expression gave nothing away. "Dan's got responsibilities in town. His pa needs him." "That's not what I asked," he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Yes, I sent him away because of you. Blackwood's men will be looking for a pregnant woman traveling alone or with a stranger. They won't be looking for a married couple living in a remote cabin." Vivian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You want people to think we're married." "I want Blackwood to have no idea where you are," Deacon corrected. "If that means letting the few people who know about this place assume we're together, so be it. Put that way, It made practical sense. Still, the idea of posing as Deacon's wife, even as a ruse, stirred complicated feelings in Vivian's chest. "How long do you think I'll need to stay here?" she asked, changing the subject. "Until the baby comes, at least. Blackwood's a patient man. He'll keep men in redemption as long as he thinks you might return." Deacon moved to the stove, pouring coffee for both of them. "After that, we'll see." The reality of her situation settled over Vivian like a heavy blanket. Months in this remote cabin, alone with a man she barely knew, waiting for her child to be born. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time since Thomas's death, she had a place to stay that felt safe. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. Deacon handed her a mug of coffee. "Don't thank me yet. Living up here isn't easy, especially in your condition. Winter's holding on late this year." "I'm stronger than I look," she reminded him. "And I'm not afraid of hard work." Something that might have been respect flickered in his mismatched eyes. "Good, because there's plenty of that to go around." The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Deacon showed Vivian around the cabin and its surroundings, teaching her the routines that governed life on the mountain. There was always work to be done: wood to chop, water to haul, meals to prepare, the garden to tend as the weather slowly warmed. To Vivian's surprise, Deacon proved to be a considerate host, if not an overly talkative one. He made sure she had everything she needed, built up the fire before dawn so she wouldn't wake to a cold cabin, and never commented on the increasingly awkward way she moved as her pregnancy advanced. For her part, Vivian threw herself into the domestic aspects of mountain life. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, organized Deacon's surprisingly extensive library, and took over the cooking, discovering that, for all his other skills, culinary arts were not among Deacon's strengths. Dan visited every few days, bringing supplies from town and news of the outside world. Blackwood and his men were still in redemption, he reported, asking questions and watching the stage depot. They'd searched the boarding house and Dr. Miller's office, but found nothing to indicate where Vivian had gone. "They're offering a reward now," Dan told them one evening in late April as they sat around the table after dinner. $200 for information on Mrs. Harper's whereabouts. Deacon's expression darkened. "Anyone talking?" "Not that I've heard. Town's got no love for outsiders throwing money around and making threats." Dan glanced at Vivian. "Doc Miller told them you'd mentioned heading to Oregon, sent them looking at the northern trails." "That was quick thinking," Deacon said approvingly. "Will they believe it?" Vivian asked. Dan shrugged. "Hard to say, but Blackwood sent 2 of his men north yesterday, so maybe." The news should have been reassuring, but Vivian found it difficult to imagine Blackwood giving up so easily. The man had tracked her across half the country already. As April gave way to May, the mountain burst into bloom. Wildflowers carpeted the meadow near the cabin, and the garden began to yield tender greens and early radishes. The weather turned consistently warmer, allowing Vivian to spend more time outdoors, often reading from Deacon's collection of books while he worked around the property. She was sitting in her favorite spot, a smooth boulder near the garden that caught the afternoon sun, when Deacon approached with an unusual hesitancy in his step. "Mrs. Harper," he began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Mr. Cross." She prompted, marking her place in the book, a well-worn copy of Wuthering Heights that she'd been surprised to find among his possessions. "I've been thinking," he said finally. "The baby will be coming in a few months." Vivian nodded, one hand moving instinctively to her rounded belly. "Late July, if my calculations are correct. There's no doctor up here," Deacon continued. "The nearest midwife is in a settlement 2 days' ride away, Understanding dawned. "You're concerned about the birth." "Yes." He looked genuinely worried, an expression she'd rarely seen on his scarred face. "I know enough field medicine to patch up wounds, but delivering a baby is different." "My mother had 5 children," Vivian said. "I helped with the last 2. I know what to expect." Deacon didn't look reassured. "Still, things can go wrong. Maybe we should consider moving you closer to town as the time approaches." The thought sent a spike of fear through Vivian. "Blackwood, I know." Deacon ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "But weighing the risks. A difficult birth out here could be fatal for both of you." The genuine concern in his voice touched Vivian deeply. Over the weeks they'd spent together, Deacon had shown himself to be a man of few words but consistent actions. He kept his promises, worked from dawn till dusk, and treated her with a quiet respect that had gradually earned her trust. "What if Dr. Miller came here?" she suggested. "When the time is close." Deacon considered this. "Possible. He's made the trip before for emergencies. But it would mean more people knowing you're here. Just the doctor. And Dan already knows." "And Mrs. Jensen," Deacon added. "She's been sending extra provisions with Dan. Woman's not subtle." Vivian smiled at that. The widow had included small gifts, with each delivery a jar of preserves, a hand-knitted baby blanket, once even a pot of her prized geraniums. "Mrs. Jensen can be trusted. She's the one who suggested I find you in the first place." Deacon looked surprised at this information. "Did she now?" "She said if anyone could get me out of town unnoticed, it would be you." He made a non-committal sound, but Vivian thought she detected a hint of pleasure at the widow's assessment of his abilities. "I'll speak with Dr. Miller when he next comes to town," Deacon decided. "See if he'd be willing to attend when the time comes." "Thank you." Vivian hesitated, then added, "For everything, these past weeks. I don't know what I would have done without your help." Deacon looked distinctly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just doing what needed doing." "No," she insisted. "You didn't have to take in a pregnant stranger, risk your safety, share your home. That's far beyond what needed doing." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "I had a sister once. Younger than me. She got in trouble with a man who promised her the world and left her with nothing but a child in her belly and shame in her heart." Vivian held her breath, afraid to interrupt this rare glimpse into Deacon's past. "Our father threw her out. Said he wouldn't have his house dishonored." The bitterness in Deacon's voice was palpable. "I was away fighting by the time I got word and went looking for her." He trailed off, but the conclusion was clear enough. "I'm so sorry," Vivian said softly. Deacon shook his head as if to dispel the memory. "It was a long time ago, but when I saw you on the road that night, alone and in trouble, I thought maybe this time I could do something right." The admission cost him, she could tell. Deacon wasn't a man accustomed to revealing his vulnerabilities, even in such a circumspect way. On impulse, Vivian reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the boulder. His skin was warm and calloused, a working man's hand. For a moment he tensed at the contact, then gradually relaxed, allowing the touch to linger. "You did," she assured him. "You are." Something shifted between them in that moment, a small but significant change, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. Deacon didn't pull his hand away, and Vivian didn't remove hers. They sat in companionable silence as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the mountain meadow. That night, for the first time since her arrival, they spoke of personal things over dinner. Vivian told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her brief career as a teacher, her disastrous marriage to Thomas Harper, a charming gambler who'd swept her off her feet and into a life of constant anxiety as his debts mounted. In return, Deacon shared fragments of his own past growing up in rural Kentucky, the hardships of the war, his years as a bounty hunter tracking men across the Western Territories. He spoke little of how he'd earned his fearsome reputation, and Vivian didn't press. The scars, both visible and hidden, told enough of that story. As May turned to June, the mountain bloomed fully into summer. The days grew longer and warmer, and Vivian's time grew shorter. Her body changed rapidly now, the baby growing strong and active within her. Sleep became more difficult, comfortable positions harder to find, simple tasks more challenging to complete. Through it all, Deacon's consideration never wavered. He built her a rocking chair from pine branches, perfectly sized for her shorter frame. He constructed a cradle for the baby, the craftsmanship surprisingly delicate for such large hands. Without being asked, he took over the heavier chores, insisting Vivian rest more as her due date approached. One evening in late June, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Vivian felt the first twinge of what might have been a contraction. It passed quickly, and she dismissed it as the false pains Dr. Miller had warned her about during his last visit. "You're frowning," Deacon observed, his gaze sharp as ever. "Pain, just uncomfortable," she assured him. "The baby's running out of room," he nodded, but his eyes remained concerned. "Miller says it could be any time now. First babies are often late," Vivian reminded him. "It could be weeks yet. Still, I don't like being this far from help." Deacon had grown increasingly anxious as her time grew near, checking and rechecking the supplies doctor. Miller had left, ensuring the trail to town remained clear, even practicing the fastest route on judgment in case of emergency. "We've made all the preparations we can," Vivian said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. In truth, she shared his concerns. Childbirth was dangerous even in the best circumstances, and a remote mountain cabin was far from ideal. As if sensing her thoughts, Deacon reached over and took her hand, a gesture that had become more natural between them in recent weeks. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Vivian Harper. You'll come through this fine." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a warm current through her body that had nothing to do with the summer evening. "With you beside me, how could I not?" She replied, her tone light though her meaning was sincere. Something flickered in Deacon's mismatched eyes, an emotion Vivian wasn't quite ready to name, though she'd seen it more frequently of late. He squeezed her hand gently, then released it, rising to his feet. "I'll check on judgment, then start dinner. You rest." As he moved away, Vivian was struck by how much had changed between them in the months since that first night on the road into redemption. The man the town called the Beast had become her protector, her companion, and though neither had spoken it aloud, something more. Something that made her heart beat faster when he entered a room, that brought color to her cheeks when their hands touched, that filled the quiet evenings with a tension both sweet and unbearable. The baby kicked vigorously, as if in agreement with her thoughts, and Vivian smiled, placing a hand over the spot. "Yes, little one," she murmured. "I know. He's a good man, no matter what they say." The contractions began in earnest 2 nights later, waking Vivian from a fitful sleep with their insistent rhythm. She lay still for a time, counting the minutes between pains, making sure this wasn't another false alarm. When the 4th contraction came, stronger than the last, she knew. The baby was coming. Moving carefully, she lit the lamp beside her bed and made her way downstairs. Deacon was asleep on the sofa, having insisted on giving up his bedroom to her months ago despite her protests. He woke instantly at the sound of her footsteps, sitting up alert and ready. "It's time," Vivian said simply. Deacon was on his feet in an instant, fully awake. "You're sure?" Dr. Miller said, "I'm sure." She gripped the back of a chair as another contraction tightened across her abdomen. "The pains are about 8 minutes apart, regular and getting stronger." He nodded, already moving with the efficiency she'd come to expect from him in a crisis. "I'll send Dan for the doctor, then heat water and prepare the room." He paused, looking at her with a mixture of concern and something that might have been fear. "What do you need right now?" "Just help me back upstairs," Vivian said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is likely to be a long process." Deacon didn't argue, simply offered his arm for support as they made their way back to the bedroom. Once she was settled, he left to wake Dan, who had been staying in the small bunkhouse behind the cabin for the past week in anticipation of just this event. Left alone, Vivian tried to focus on her breathing as the next contraction built. She was afraid, she couldn't deny it. But beneath the fear was a current of determination stronger than any she'd felt before. This child, her child, was coming into the world, and she would do whatever it took to see that it arrived safely. Deacon returned with hot water, clean linens, and the medical supplies Dr. Miller had left. His expression was grave but calm as he set everything within reach. "Dan's gone for the doctor," he reported. "Riding judgment, he'll make better time." Vivian nodded, then gasped as another contraction seized her. This one was stronger, the pain radiating from her back around to her abdomen in a tight band. Without being asked, Deacon moved to her side, offering his hand. She took it gratefully, squeezing hard as the contraction peaked, then subsided. "I'm staying," he said when she'd caught her breath. It wasn't a question. Vivian looked up at him, this scarred, solitary man who had become the center of her world in ways she'd never anticipated. "Yes," she agreed. "Stay." The labor progressed steadily through the night. Deacon remained by Vivian's side, offering water, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, supporting her when she needed to walk to ease the pain in her back. He said little, but his presence was a constant comfort, his strength something she could lean on when her own faltered. Dawn was breaking when Dr. Miller finally arrived, looking weary from the hard ride but professionally alert as he assessed the situation. "You're doing well, Mrs. Harper," he assured her after his examination. "Baby's in the right position and you're progressing normally. I'd say another few hours at most." The doctor's presence relieved some of Deacon's visible tension, but he refused to leave Vivian's side even when Dr. Miller suggested he might want to wait outside. "I'm staying," he repeated, his voice brooking no argument. "Doctor." Miller raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. "As you wish. But birth isn't a pretty business, Mr. Cross." "Neither is war," Deacon replied simply. "I've seen worse." As the morning wore on, Vivian's labor intensified. The contractions came faster and harder, leaving her gasping and clutching at Deacon's hand with a strength that surprised them both. Through it all, he remained steady, his voice a low, constant reassurance in her ear. "You're doing fine," he murmured. "Strong as iron, Vivian, just a little longer." When the final stage came, it was with a rush of intensity that took her breath away. The urge to push was overwhelming, primal, beyond conscious control. "That's it," Dr. Miller encouraged. "The baby's coming. Push with the next pain." Vivian bore down with all her might, dimly aware of Deacon supporting her shoulders, his breath warm against her hair as he whispered words she couldn't quite make out but felt the meaning of nonetheless. Words of strength, of belief, of something that might have been love. With a final, tremendous effort, she pushed again, and suddenly the pressure eased in a rush of release. A moment of silence, then the most beautiful sound Vivian had ever heard filled the room, the indignant cry of a newborn taking its first breath. "A girl, Doctor," Miller announced, holding up the tiny, perfect being. A healthy baby girl. Tears streamed down Vivian's face as the doctor placed the infant on her chest. She was red and wrinkled and impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that proved remarkably robust as she announced her arrival to the world. "Hello, little one," Vivian whispered, cradling the child close. "Welcome." She became aware of Deacon still beside her, his expression one of wonder as he gazed at the baby. Tentatively, as if afraid his touch might somehow harm such a delicate creature, he reached out a single finger to stroke the infant's cheek. "She's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Vivian looked up at him, this man who had saved them both in more ways than one. "Would you like to hold her?" Deacon's eyes widened with something like panic. "I don't know how like this," she said, and carefully transferred the swaddled infant into his arms. He held the baby with infinite care, his large hands cradling her as if she were made of spun glass. The contrast was striking this fearsome man, scarred and hardened by years of violence, holding a newborn with such gentleness that it brought fresh tears to Vivian's eyes. "What will you name her?" Dr. Miller asked as he finished his post-delivery tasks. Vivian hadn't given much thought to names, too focused on survival to plan beyond the birth. But looking at Deacon holding her daughter, the answer came with perfect clarity. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." The days following Hope's birth passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy for Vivian. Dr. Miller stayed for 2 days to ensure mother and child were recovering well, then returned to town with strict instructions for rest and proper nutrition. Deacon proved to be an unexpected source of support during this time. He learned to change diapers with the same focus he brought to tracking game, studied Dr. Miller's instructions for infant care as if they were military orders, and spent hours simply watching Hope sleep in the cradle he'd made for her. "You're good with her," Vivian observed one evening as Deacon walked the floor with the fussing infant, his large frame swaying in a gentle rhythm that never failed to soothe the baby. He looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "Am I? Better than many fathers I've seen," she confirmed. "You have a natural way with her." A complicated emotion crossed his scarred face. "Never thought I'd have the chance to hold a child," he admitted. "Not with this face, this reputation." Vivian's heart ached at the loneliness implicit in his words. The face doesn't matter to Hope. And as for reputations, she smiled softly. "The town may call you a beast, but I know better." Deacon's gaze held hers for a long moment, the connection between them almost tangible in the quiet cabin. Then Hope made a small sound, and he looked down at the infant in his arms, his expression softening. "She's asleep," he whispered. "I'll put her down." Vivian watched as he placed the baby in her cradle with exquisite care, his scarred face transformed by tenderness. In that moment, she acknowledged the truth she'd been gradually accepting for months. Now she had fallen in love with Deacon Cross, the man redemption feared, the man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect since the night they'd met. As July turned to August, life settled into a new rhythm centered around Hope's needs. The baby thrived, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. Dan brought news from town that Blackwood had finally left Redemption, apparently convinced that Vivian had indeed traveled north to Oregon. "Doesn't mean he's given up," Deacon cautioned when she expressed relief at the news. "Just means he's looking elsewhere for now." "We can't hide on this mountain forever," Vivian pointed out, though the idea of leaving filled her with a different kind of dread now. This cabin had become home in a way no place had been since her childhood. Deacon was silent for a long moment. "No," he agreed finally, "not forever." The unspoken question hung between them. What then? Vivian had no home to return to, no family waiting, no prospects beyond the uncertain future of a widow with a child. And Deacon. Deacon had his solitary life on the mountain, his reputation, his reasons for staying apart from the world below. The answer came on a warm evening in late August as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Hope was asleep in Vivian's arms, her tiny face peaceful in slumber. "I've been thinking," Deacon said, breaking a comfortable silence. "About what happens next." Vivian's heart quickened. "Oh. There's a small ranch for sale down in the valley, not too close to town but near enough for convenience. Good water, decent grazing land." He spoke carefully, as if each word had been considered in advance. "I've had my eye on it for a while. You're thinking of leaving the mountain." Vivian tried to keep her voice neutral, though her mind was racing with possibilities. Deacon turned to look at her, his mismatched eyes intent. "I'm thinking it might be a good place to raise a family, if that's something you might want." The meaning behind his words was clear, and Vivian's breath caught in her throat. "Deacon, are you asking? I know I'm not what most women would want," he interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "This face my past. I've done things I can't undo. But I swear to you, Vivian, I would spend every day trying to be worthy of you and hope. If you'll have me." Tears blurred Vivian's vision as the last barriers around her heart dissolved. "The only thing I want," she said softly, "is the man who saw a woman in trouble and offered his hand without hesitation. The man who built a cradle before he knew if I'd stay. The man who holds my daughter as if she's the most precious thing he's ever touched." She reached out to cup his scarred cheek. "I want you, Deacon Cross, exactly as you are." Something like wonder crossed his face. "You mean that?" "With all my heart." He leaned forward then, slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she chose. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it brought fresh tears to her eyes. Hope stirred between them but didn't wake, as if blessing this new beginning in her own small way. When they parted, Deacon's smile transformed his face, softening the harsh lines of his scar, lighting his mismatched eyes with a joy Vivian had never seen there before. "I love you," he said simply. "Have since that first night, I think, though I was too stubborn to admit it." Vivian laughed softly. "And I love you, my gentle beast." They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the cabin, with Dr. Miller officiating, Mrs. Jensen fussing over the wedding dinner and Dan standing as witness. Hope, dressed in a gown Mrs. Jensen had sewn from her own wedding dress, slept through the entire proceedings in a bassinet decorated with late summer wildflowers. By October, they had moved to the ranch in the valley. The house was modest but solid, with room to grow as their family expanded. Deacon took to ranching with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, while Vivian established a small school for the children of neighboring homesteads, teaching from the front room 3 days a week with Hope in a basket beside her desk. Slowly, the people of Redemption came to see Deacon differently. The man they had called the Beast became Mr. Cross, the rancher with the mismatched eyes and the pretty wife who'd seen beyond his scars. Children stopped running when he came to town. Women nodded greetings instead of crossing to the other side of the street. Men who had once whispered about his violent past now consulted him on matters of grazing rights and water access. Victor Blackwood never returned to Redemption, though Deacon kept watch for years, unwilling to take chances with his family's safety. Eventually, news came that Blackwood had met his end in a Denver gambling hall, shot by a man he tried to cheat once too often. Hope grew into a bright, curious child with her mother's spirit and her adoptive father's quiet strength. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, Daniel Thomas Cross, born on a spring morning with his father pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until Vivian's laughter called him in to meet his son. On warm summer evenings, the family would often sit on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set behind the mountains where their story had begun. Deacon would hold Vivian's hand in his, their fingers intertwined, while the children played in the yard before them. "You ever regret it?" Vivian asked him once, as they watched Hope teaching her little brother to catch fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Taking in a pregnant stranger that night. Giving up your solitude." Deacon looked at her, his scarred face softened by the years of happiness they'd shared. "Only thing I regret," he said, "is all the years I spent alone before you found me." "I think we found each other," Vivian corrected gently. He smiled, the expression now as natural to him as the scowl had once been. "You saw me," he said simply. "When everyone else saw a beast, you saw a man." "The best man I've ever known," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as their children's laughter filled the twilight air. And in that moment, as in all the moments that would follow, Vivian knew that the road that had led her to redemption with all its hardships and dangers had been the right one all along. For it had brought her to this man, this family, this life built with hands both strong and gentle, and a love that had transformed them both.